You've taken a wrong turn down Creep Street.
Citizens of the Milky Way, this is Maureen Bogey.
And this is Dylan Hackworth.
And you are listening to the Creep Street Podcast. Thank you guys so much for listening. We are so happy to have you. Before we get started, just wanted to remind everyone that we are on all the great, nasty social media platforms. Okay, I'm talking Twitter at Creep Street Pod, Facebook at Creep Street Podcast. You know what? Instagram is also at Creep Street Podcast. Okay, we're also on TikTok. We haven't figured it out yet, but we will. Okay, so just give us a minute.
We will.
You know what? We have a lot going on. Okay, and so anyway, also just feel free to please let your friends know about us. Do that share, do that like, do that subscribe, do that rate, do that review. You understand what we're talking about. Now that we're all caught up, Dylan, please tell the people what we're going to be talking about today.
Today we are talking about the Axman of New Orleans.
The Assman of New Orleans?
The Axman of New Orleans.
So he's not shaking his head at some boobies, but he's definitely loving the ass.
He's smothering them in ass.
Ass.
Oh, sorry. I read that it's the Axman. I was reading the wrong resources.
Oh, God.
Oh, my God.
You were reading those books about the Assman of
About
NOLA.
the Axman. Yes, I sure was.
What a hero. Oh, that guy did so much.
But the Axman?
Yeah, what did he do?
Horrible person.
Okay, let's talk about him. Or them. Her.
Or them. Because this
she,
person
her.
was never caught. Never caught. Our story takes place in the 1910s in New Orleans.
Okay.
When the jazz was hot and the gumbo was even hotter. So briefly, let's set up the socio-political climate of the time.
Okay.
Most people know New Orleans and its history is steeped in French culture. It's very much a large part of the city's identity to this day. Well, at the turn of the 20th century, that status quo was quickly disrupted as many cultures began to grow in the city and kind of helped it create the vibrant identity we think of New Orleans having today.
Right.
Immigration from Italy, specifically Sicily,
Oh.
skyrocketed in New Orleans at this time. By the 1910s, it's estimated that 8 out of 10 folks living in the French Quarter were of Italian descent, mostly
Wow.
Sicilian. Yeah. In addition to this, many recently freed African Americans had also come to New Orleans to start a new life as well. And so, yeah, that just kind of added to the melting pot, if you will, of the cultural side of New Orleans. But this time also saw a big jump in organized crime. Arms of the Italian mafia, such as the Black Hand, which we will talk about often, and the Costa Nostra, which specialized in blackmail and extortion, had become quite powerful in the city of New Orleans.
Oh.
Now, the Black Hand in particular, they would particularly target Italian immigrants who were looking to start up small businesses. While sometimes Italians would actually seek out the protection of the mafia,
Right.
the majority of them were as terrified of them as a non-Italian would be. So, now that we've set the scene,
Okay, it's been set.
let's get to the nitty-gritty.
Okay, thank you.
Let's get to why the people fucking came here. On the morning of March 23rd, 1918,
Okay.
New Orleans was awakened to the shocking headline of a gruesome axe murder that had taken place the night before or just in the wee hours of the morning.
And just to clarify, this was an axe murder, not an ass murder.
The victims were Joseph and Catherine Maggio. They had been brutally hacked to death in their beds by a fiend wielding an axe.
Okay, I didn't know you were going to say that. Now I feel bad about the whole ass murder situation.
I bet they would have preferred ass.
I guess that's true, so you're welcome.
And facing adjacent to their room was the grocery that
Okay.
they owned and operated.
Oh, they own... Okay, great. Okay.
To add further confusion, no property or valuables were stolen. Whoever killed the Maggios were there solely for murder.
That always makes it scarier because if they steal some property or they steal some valuables, you're like, okay, they were here to get the things. They were here to get the money, and then
Exactly.
something got in the way. That is, of course, very sad, very scary. Not saying that doesn't matter.
Exactly.
It does. But then when someone comes along and they just kill, you're like, oh, God.
Yeah. Now, before I get too deep into this, I was going to do this at the top, but let me state my sources. My first source was the book The Axman of New Orleans, A True Story by Miriam C. Davis. And I also used an article she wrote for Smithsonian Magazine.
Oh.
Entitled The Axman of New Orleans Preyed on Italian Immigrants, also by Miriam Davis, February 15th, 2018. And finally, The Axeman, The Brutal History of the Axman of New Orleans by Wallace Edwards. Now that we've stated the sources, like I said, what kind of confused them even more was there was no sign of burglary, of anything like that. Whoever did this just wanted to shed some fucking blood. The couple was discovered by the Maggio's two younger brothers who were returning home from a night of drinking. Initially, they were arrested for the crime, but were, released, obviously. Which is going to become a fucking theme in this. Whoever initially reports it gets fucking arrested.
I know, God.
The police were baffled by what they found. And yes, fingerprinting was technically possible in 1918, but very untrustworthy and was not conducted here. The axe was confiscated merely as a murder weapon. The whole concept of this being an axeman, or this axe being a vital piece of this killer's identity, had not been thought of yet.
Right.
The police walked the area asking people if they had seen anything. They got more than they bargained for.
Oh, God.
Because nearby, written in chalk on the asphalt, in what appeared to be a child's handwriting, was the words, "Mrs. Maggio will sit up tonight, just like Mrs. Tony." Whether this message was a warning of the violence to come or perhaps a warning to the murderer not to proceed was unclear, but what was undeniable was that whoever wrote this was clearly referencing the crime.
Yes.
So, what was found at the crime scene? Well, as you might expect, an axe, a razor blade, and the two bodies, and a wooden chisel, and the door panel that had been removed by the killer in order to gain access to the home.
Oh.
They believe the axe was actually Mr. Maggio's, which suggests that the killer had the stones to enter the place unarmed and used whatever the fuck was available.
Damn.
And that's another thing. Often they think the killer grabbed an axe there.
Yeah. Also, just what a different time. People just had axes around.
And they'll talk about that too. Yes, that's a very good point. The razor is believed to have belonged to Andrew Maggio, who was a barber who later told police he had brought the razor home for sharpening. Mrs. Maggio was nearly decapitated when found. The razor had been used to cut her throat in addition to the axe.
Oh, God.
Much to the embarrassment of the police, the brothers were clearly not involved with the murder, and so they were released. But what about this message written on the sidewalk, on the asphalt?
That it maybe looks like a child wrote it?
Does this imply that someone was working with the Axeman and that this was written to let him know he may be killing two rather than one person? Mrs. Maggio will be sitting up tonight. The next month, on June 28th, 1918, the Axeman would strike again. A baker named John Zanka was making his usual deliveries, and he arrived at the residence of Louis Bessumer and his wife, Anna Lowe, who ran a grocery.
Another grocery, okay.
Zanka noticed a door panel missing upon his arrival.
Another door panel?
Yeah. Alarmed, he began pounding on the door, shouting out their names to try and rouse them to see if they were okay. When no one answered, Zanka grew very nervous. He kept pounding on the door and calling out to them, and that's when he heard a shuffle coming from inside.
Oh, God.
Someone was approaching the door. It slowly opened to reveal Louis Bessemer, except he was bleeding profusely from his skull.
Oh, God.
Zanka called an ambulance and waited with the family. The couple survived, but with lasting injuries.
Jeez.
Anna Lowe would die weeks later in early August, but before passing, she claimed the attacker was her husband, Bessumer. He would spend several months in jail before getting released.
So she must have been confused, I guess?
I don't
or
know. We
maybe
will
with
get to
the
that.
injuries. Okay.
Yes. Now, on August 5th, 1918, a pregnant woman by the last name of Schneider was sleeping soundly in her bed.
Oh, God.
And the poor woman happened to wake up right as an axe was being brought down upon her head. When her husband, Mr. Schneider, a local businessman, returned home, he found his wife alive, but on the brink of death.
Oh, God, she was still alive?
Still alive.
Oh, that is brutal.
He rushed her to the hospital, but she was unable to remember much of the identity of the perpetrator. Their child was due in only a matter of weeks.
Oh, God.
And if there is a blessing in this dark story, it is that both Mrs. Schneider and her baby survived.
Okay, wild, but very lovely.
A few weeks later, Mrs. Schneider gave birth to a healthy baby girl.
Oh, good.
So let's live it up to those ladies.
Give it up, yes.
I mean, God damn.
A true fighter.
Absolutely.
Damn.
But here's what's interesting about this attack. There was no chisel found.
Okay.
No door panel had been removed, and also the Schneiders had no affiliation to the grocery business.
Oh, okay.
So if the occupation demographic, i.e. a grocer, was the part of the identity of this killer, they obviously didn't do that. And of course, the method of entry was not the usual method. So really, that just leaves the axe. 5 days later, an Italian barber named Joseph Romano was murdered by the Axeman. But this time by being bludgeoned by the brunt end of the axe.
Oh, God.
Joseph Romano's nieces said they saw a figure dressed in black fleeing the home, and their uncle was taken to a hospital where he died 2 days later. Police did find a door panel that had been chiseled away, and this is when it was made official that the Axeman was a serial killer.
Okay.
The pattern of method of entry and weapon and all that stuff added up. Well, to the relief of many, the rest of 1918 in New Orleans was axe murder free. In addition to this, World War I had come to a close, so everyone was resting a little bit easier.
Oh, people were feeling pretty good.
But this rest would not last long.
Oh, no.
As that winter, a flu epidemic ran rampant through the city, claiming the lives of 3,500 people before it was finally subdued in the spring of 1919.
Wow.
So we now cut to the night of March 10th, 1919. Just over the Mississippi River, in the town of Gretna, Louisiana.
Gretna? Okay. I don't know where that is, but I love it.
A loud ruckus was emanating from the home of the Cortimiglia family. Their neighbor, an Italian grocer named Orlando Giordano, heard a commotion and ran over to investigate. What he found was a ghastly sight.
Oh, no.
Charles Cortimiglia and his wife Rose and their young baby had been brutally bludgeoned by the Axeman.
Oh, no.
The child died, and they believe it died instantly. And Rose and the husband, were still alive.
Oh, God.
The couple survived their injuries after being treated at the hospital. While this appeared to be another crime perpetrated by the Axeman, Mrs. Cortimiglia claimed that the Giordanos were responsible for the act. Specifically, Frank Giordano, who was living with his father. So police quickly arrested Frank Giordano based on Rose's accusation. Strangely enough, Rose's own husband, Charles, even disputed her claim that the Giordanos were involved.
Oh, okay.
And we'll come back to this. Frank was even given the death penalty. Rose would, about 9 months later, recant her statement the following year, and the Giordanos were released.
Wow.
So, big history of, like, literally the person who reports it fucking gets arrested.
Yeah.
Like, what the fuck is that about?
But you know what? I do get that a little bit, just because, murders are usually done by someone that the person knows, in a close person to the victim. So in that way, I understand, but it is weird that it's like they're always arresting the person that reported it.
In the Smithsonian article I read, Miriam Davis makes a point of stressing it sounds like Rose also kind of gave that accusation almost against her will. It sounded like the police, while she was in the hospital, were like hounding her, like, who was it? Come on, it was Frank, wasn't it? It was the Giordanos, huh? Come on. It was like that sort of a thing. And even the nurses said she seemed reluctant to.
She was just like,
it seemed like they were pushing, just they wanted this thing wrapped up.
Pushed it on her.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's the sad thing. You hear a lot about false confessions,
yeah,
which is very sad. I'm sure this kind of thing happens, and especially happened then too, where people are kind of pressured into or convinced into thinking that they know what happened.
So while there was apparently a history of competition between the two families, police could find no evidence that the Giordanos were involved, so obviously they were let go.
Okay.
But when the news of the young child's death became public, it ignited a frenzy. Here's a killer so monstrous that they wouldn't even spare a child.
Yeah.
And the pattern confirmed the Axeman didn't want money or jewelry or even vengeance. He just wanted to kill. Well, the New Orleans police weren't getting anywhere with leads. And on top of this, the newspapers were just kind of pouring gasoline on the fire of what had become a kind of a big moment of hysteria in the city. You know, in a weird way, you kind of can't blame it. I mean, people at this time, they were gobbling up newspapers because everyone wanted to know about this Axeman, right?
Oh, yeah.
So, of course, they're pouring the gas on the fire.
And I mean, can you imagine if you were a frickin', Italian grocer?
Now, this only made the job of the police harder, as now they were getting reported Axeman sightings from all over the city, and there was no real way to know how many of them were actually legit, how many of them might have been real crimes but were confused with the Axeman, and also, how many were real but just copycats.
Right.
Also, of course, false reports, you name it. Likewise, the French Quarter had become crazy with nightly reports about door panels having been found chiseled open.
Well, because I'm sure some people are just so paranoid about it.
Oh, I'm sure.
And then other, drunk little turds cults are out there, like doing pranks on people, I'm sure.
Then, on Thursday, March 13th, 1919, the local Times Picayune's newspaper published something that caused what could be described as the year 1919's version of blowing up the internet.
Okay, yes.
They published a signed letter from the Axman himself.
What?
Which bore the return address, Hell.
Okay, my timeline is exploding.
It had been sent to them and the New Orleans Police Department, and here is what it reads.
Hell, March 13th, 1919. Esteemed mortal, they have never caught me and they never will. They have never seen me, for I am invisible. Even as the ether surrounds your earth, I'm not a human being, but a spirit, and a demon from the hottest hell. I am what you Orleanians and your foolish police call the Axman. When I see fit, I shall come down and claim other victims. I alone know who they shall be. I shall leave no other clues except my bloody axe, besmeared with blood and brains of he who I have sent below to keep me company. If you wish, you may tell the police to be careful not to rile me. Of course, I am a reasonable spirit. I take no offense at the way they have conducted their investigations in the past. In fact, they have been so utterly stupid as to not only amuse me, but His Satanic Majesty, Francis Joseph, etc. But tell them to beware. Let them not try to discover what I am, for it were better they were never born than to incur the wrath of the Axman. I don't think there is any need of such a warning, for I feel sure the police will always dodge me as they have in the past. They are wise and know how to keep away from all harm. Undoubtedly you Orleanians think of me as a most horrible murderer, which I am. But I could be worse if I wanted to. If I wished, I could pay a visit to your city every night. At will, I could slay thousands of your best citizens, for I am in close relationship with the Angel of Death. Now, to be exact, at 12:15 earthly time on next Tuesday night, I'm going to pass over New Orleans. In my infinite mercy, I'm going to make a little proposition to you people. Here it is. I am very fond of jazz music, and I swear by all the devils in the nether regions that every person shall be spared in whose home a jazz band is in full swing at the time I have mentioned. If everyone has a jazz band going, well, so much better for your people. One thing is certain, and that is that some of your people who do not jazz it up on Tuesday night, if there be any, will get the axe. Well, as I am cold and crave the warmth of my native Tartarus, and it is about time I leave your earthly home, I will cease my discourse. Hoping that thou wilt publish this, that may go well with thee, I have been and will be the worst spirit that has ever existed, whether in fact or in the realm of fancy. Signed, the Axman.
Okay, so this cat just loves jazz.
I could be wrong, but I Googled, who would he be referencing when he references a Satanic Majesty Francis Joseph? Closest thing I could find was the father of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand.
Yeah, I guess
I don't know. Obviously, I don't know my Ferdinandian politics that well. I don't know if he was seen as a good or a bad leader, so I don't know if it might not even be who he's referencing. But in terms of just the biggest name in history at that time,
I mean, it does make some kind of sense just because World War I was
that actually
recent,
makes
and,
a lot of
Franz
sense.
Ferdinand was kind of what kicked off World War I or his death. But Creep Street, if you know more about this, please email us, creepstreetpodcast@gmail.com.
Now, it's probably not a coincidence that the following Tuesday, the Axman was referencing in his letter was March 19th. This happened to be the feast of St. Joseph. which is a big day of celebration for the Italian-American community in New Orleans.
Yes.
And since Italians now made up a third of the city's demographic, it had become a big day of celebration for the city as a whole. March 19th, 1919.
A lot of 19s.
Came and went with no murder by the Axman. It is often said that night was the wildest night of partying New Orleans had ever seen. And if that's the case, well, all that hot jazz must have kept the Axman away.
Oh my gosh, this is reminding me of like the Bible with the lamb's blood.
That's
above
exactly
people's
what it
doors.
is. It's a biblical thing. It's
Yeah.
like the putting of the blood of the lamb's blood above the door so that your firstborn son is spared, your firstborn child or whatever. Like in the Bible. Yeah, it's very biblical.
Very interesting. But it ends up being like everyone's having a good time, which is very interesting. But also jazz, were people kind of like afraid of jazz? Not everyone, but some people, they were like, oh, this is the devil's music.
I think like anything, like rock and roll
Right,
in the 50s,
right.
I think it was seen as, jazz.
Not that like everyone like hated it.
Right, I
obviously,
think it
but
was-
just some people were like, I don't know.
Like most things that are fucking sweet, they're
Right.
thought to be bad at first. So. Well, for several months, there were no incidents involving the Axman.
Okay, interesting.
But on Sunday morning, August 3rd, 1919, in the early hours before dawn, an intruder beat an 18-year-old young lady named Susan Lawman with a blunt object.
Oh God.
He knocked out several of her teeth, but was scared away by her screams for help.
Oh.
She lived in a room next door to her parents. And though Sarah Lauman didn't fit the description of the Axeman's usual target, an axe was found right outside her home. But this attack in particular was very different. Instead of a chiseled open door panel, the attacker entered through an open window. In fact, upon being examined by a physician, they said it seemed unlikely the weapon was an axe. The attack seemed to be more about injuring her rather than killing her. And while this attack is often included as one committed by the Axeman, it strays very much from the typical description, and I even wonder if it is. And we'll get into that at the end when we're going over motives and ideas and stuff like that. It would only be a week later, on August 10th, that the Axeman would return. That night, an Italian grocer named Steve Bocca slept soundly in his home on Elysian Fields in the French Quarter. Slowly, he woke up from his sleep to see a shadowy figure standing over him. Boom! The bludgeoning began.
Oh no.
Covered with blood and with a fractured skull, Bocca was able to call out to his neighbor Frank, who opened the door to find Bocca collapsing to the floor. And Frank stayed with Bocca until the police arrived. He was kind of dropping in and out of consciousness. While he did survive, he was unable to provide the police with any description of his attacker. And in a stunning act of what the fuck, the police arrested Frank and briefly interrogated him, but he was released after.
Jeez, yeah, it's like the police, they just have no ideas at all. So they're just like, arrest
Right.
this guy.
Now, while Bocca couldn't give the police much in regards of information, the little that he could seemed to match up with what some of the other victims had reported. A large figure circling them right before the attack. The attacker neither verbally threatens or offers an explanation to the victim. He used a wood chisel to enter through the door panel in the back door, and he used an axe that was found on the premises. Which, once again, let's talk about a fucking axe murderer who doesn't even bring their own axe.
Yeah, what the
He's not a BYOB motherfucker.
No.
He's not a BYOB kind of guy. And in addition to this, of course, the victim was an Italian grocer. Now, 10 weeks later, on October 27th, the Axeman would strike again for the final time. Mike Pepitone, an Italian grocer, was fast asleep at his home that he shared with his wife and their 7 children. Hearing noises emanating from the bedroom, Mrs. Pepitone opened the door to find her husband on the bed, having been beaten to death. His skull was smashed and his face was barely recognizable.
Oh, God.
Though he was not yet dead, he would be shortly. Rushing about the bedroom, she discovered 2 assailants as they passed by her, exiting the room and then the house. 2 assailants.
Wow.
Other than one being tall and the other short, Miss Pepitone had no other description she could give police. Police interviewed the locals in the area, and they turned up some interesting stuff. Neighbors came forward and told them of some Italian gentlemen that had paid Mr. Pepitone a visit the day before his murder. These 2 men were said to be lurking out in front of the store, and when they confronted Mr. Pepitone, they had a, quote, animated discussion.
Okay.
So it sounded like tempers were flaring. So let's reflect over this thing as a whole. It's a fact that there was an Axeman who operated in New Orleans, but it's very possible that more murders and attacks were attributed to him than he actually committed. As for a killer named the Axeman, a good portion of the attacks attributed to him did not even involve an axe. Perhaps the most effective weapon that he used was a lead pipe, which was on his final victim, Mr. Pepitone. And while the press did make an effort to express that fact, the public sort of did it on their own.
Right.
The book had a great quote essentially saying, the method is not nearly as important as the madness. In the fervor of it, people want to add to this mystique, of an axeman. Oh, and the book makes a point that an axe was a standard item to have in New Orleans at the time. In fact, axe murders were actually quite common in the early 20th century.
Right.
And in fact, one of the largest killing sprees in America up until that time happened just a few years earlier in Louisiana in 1912. The New York Times reported that 31 people had been slain by an axe-murdering cult named the Sacrifice Sect. One of the victims was the wife of one of the cult members.
Oh.
And it's said that the cult reportedly used a combination of voodoo and Christian rites in their rituals that would obviously then end in an axe murder.
Okay, yeah.
From what I was gathering when I was reading it, the book tries to say, remember that thing written on the asphalt at the very beginning? Mrs. Montague was standing up tonight just like Mrs. Tony. If I remember correctly, I want to say that there was a Mr. Tony who was killed by the cult. And so there is speculation that that is referencing the cult killings from a few years earlier.
That's so interesting. Almost kind of like whoever this Axeman is definitely at least knew about the cult killings and maybe was involved with that cult.
Also, consider at the time, the police were dealing with the actual Black Hand. We said a branch of the Italian mafia that deals with extortion. Probably, and I think a number of these murders were actually the mafia, but they used this method so that it would then get blamed on the Axeman.
Yes,
the
that
Axeman
makes sense.
was kind of a red herring, that they would use as cover, essentially.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Now, this next part, I'm going to read exactly from the book just because I didn't want to mess up any of the information. I wanted to make sure I got it out straight. So on December 2nd, 1921, a man named Joseph Mumphrey was shot and killed while he was walking down a busy Los Angeles street. The shooter, who was described as a woman, wearing black and heavily veiled, had stepped from a doorway of a building and shot him repeatedly, making certain he was dead. The woman simply stood there then, gun in hand, and made no attempt to escape. When taken to a nearby police station, the suspect identified herself as Mrs. Esther Albano, but initially refused to say why she had committed the murder. Just days later, she started talking and provided police with an incredible story. Not only was she the widow of Mike Pepitone, the last victim of the New Orleans Axeman, but the man she killed, Joseph Mumphrey, she claims, was the Axeman himself.
Interesting.
Esther claimed she had married her second husband, Angelo Albano, soon after her first husband's death and moved to Los Angeles. Angelo had gone missing 2 months earlier, and she believed that Mumphrey, who had been threatening them both, was responsible. She also insisted that she had recognized him as Mike Pepitone's killer from the brief glimpse she got back of him in 1919. And while the newspapers jumped on the idea that Joseph Mumphrey had been the Axeman, and that Esther Albano was a heroine for killing him, police were not so certain. But Mumphrey was a notorious member of the Black Hand and heavily involved in various Italian criminal organizations, including a prior conviction for dynamiting a store in Arkansas. That was kind of how he made a name for himself, I guess, was he would dynamite shit, and then the Black Hand was like, hey, you want a job?
Good Lord.
Given the prospect of finally solving the Axeman murders, the New Orleans Police Department launched their own investigation and turned up some more interesting coincidences. Joseph Mumphrey had actually been living in New Orleans back in 1911 when the first axe murders occurred.
Okay.
In that same year, he was sent to prison on an extortion charge, and the murders stopped immediately. It was only after he was paroled in 1918 that the Axeman murders began again. After Mike Pepitone's death, Mumphrey left New Orleans and moved to California. Unfortunately, this was the only evidence linking Mumphrey to the Axeman murders. And even the newspapers admitted that the dates could have been coincidences. While he certainly could have been Mike Pepitone's killer, there was no real motive for him to have committed the other killings. Also, thanks to Esther Albano, Mumphrey was no longer available to question. With no other evidence to go on, the New Orleans police reluctantly concluded that the Axeman murders were still unsolved. As for Esther Albano, she pleaded guilty to killing Mumphrey when her case came to trial in April 1922. Though her lawyer tried to argue that it was justifiable homicide, the judge threw out this defense and Esther was sentenced to 10 years in prison. She eventually was paroled after serving 3 years in prison and vanished into obscurity. No word remains on Angelo Albano's ultimate fate. It's sounding like that Mumphrey guy was a pretty goddamn good candidate.
Yeah.
Even if it wasn't him, it's not looking good.
There's
it
reasons-
sounds like he was maybe just an enforcer for the mob, and he just had a fucking weird way of going about things, and it kind of became his MO.
Yes. That does make sense.
Whew.
And is a weird...
It's weird.
What a weird guy.
It's weird. And if there's anything I missed, I'm sorry. There's so much lore to this story. If there's anything I missed or skipped over or muddled together, I'm so sorry, but this was a lot of fun to research. Well, that's going to wrap it up for the Axman of New Orleans. Once again, my name is Dylan Hackworth.
I'm Maureen Bogey, and I cannot wait until we do our Ass Man episode.
Oh, wait till our Ass Man episode.
You're going to love it.
Oh, can't wait to do the research for that. Citizens of the Milky Way, good night and goodbye.